or engineering reports, as well as archaeological sites. So that includes both of those things. A lot of times around the office and talking to people who are in preservation, they'll talk about the MIHP or MIHP forms, and they're talking about architecture stuff, but it's actually also the archaeology. That is also a part of the Maryland inventory. In addition to the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties, we also maintain the National Register files for Maryland. The National Register, if you don't know a whole lot about it, it was established by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. That act did there were four major things that it did. It established an advisory council for historic preservation, a national advisory council. That advises the President of the United States as well as Congress on matters relating to national historic preservation as well as archaeology. It also established an office in each state to maintain the state inventory and nominate sites that meet one of four criteria for inclusion on the National Register. Those are the SHPO's office. You'll hear me say several times the SHPO's office or the SHPO. Those are the offices in each state that manage that. As I said, there's sites that go onto the National Register have to meet one of four criteria for inclusion on that. I won't get into the four different criteria. I will say that criteria D is the one that almost all archaeological sites end up falling under, and those are locations or properties that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important to history or prehistory. So that's where most archaeology falls in. It basically can it answer research questions about the past. The National Register does not provide protection. I have to say that up front. A lot of people think that it does. It really doesn't provide protection. What it does is it makes properties eligible for grants, for loans, and tax incentives. And it does, I guess in some sense, it does provide a degree of protection, but it's rare that it will stop development. Instead, what we have is a section of the National Register or the National Historic Preservation Act. The fourth thing that it does that I mentioned is Section 106. So this is a part of the National Historic Preservation Act that requires consideration for historic and archaeological resources when development is undertaken either by a federal agency, undertaken with federal money or aid, or which requires a federal permit, right? So if there's taxpayer money going into it, we have to at least consider what the impacts of the development project will be to that historic or archaeological resource. And we have similar laws in the state of Maryland that pertain to state money. So we do the same thing in Maryland, but at the state level. Okay. So this slide sort of lays out how the trust is organized into physical functional offices. In addition to the offices that you see here, which are the offices up in Crownsville where I work, we also have, as part of the trust, Jefferson Patterson Park Museum, which is the home to the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab, the MAC Lab. So that is also a part of MHT, but physically very separate from us. They're down in St. Leonard, in Leonardtown, Maryland, Calvert County, and we're up in Crownsville, where our offices are. We're part of the Maryland Department of Planning. So those offices in Crownsville, we're divided into four physical or functional offices. There's the Office of Management, which includes the State Historic Preservation Officer, Miss Elizabeth Hughes, her Deputy Director, her Operations Management staff. Those are the folks that, push the paper, make all the photocopies, keep the lights on, pay the bills, make sure that we have what we need in order to do our jobs, and that we're doing all the paperwork and things that are typical of a government or bureaucratic entity. There's the Office of Planning, Education, and Outreach, or OPEO. That administers one of the big things that they do is they administer the Maryland Heritage Areas program. That is a heritage tourism program that is offered throughout the state. If you belong to one of those heritage areas, it makes your site potentially eligible for all sorts of grants and assistance from the state to produce heritage tourism products. So, tours, gift shops, those kinds of things. They also provide historic preservation planning assistance and opportunities to local governments and other partners throughout the state. And then they are responsible for most of our annual reporting and public outreach at the level of the entire trust. They handle public outreach. We have our own thing that we do in archaeology, but they sort of handle the big picture of reaching out to the legislators and the public at large. The Office of Preservation Services, they handle the project review and compliance stuff, that section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act that I talked about. Making sure that the people who do the archaeology under section 106 and who do the examinations of standing structures, that they are writing up reports and collecting documentation that meets the standards set by the law. So they review a lot of reports, about 5,000 reports a year, and go through that office. So it's a heavy task that they undertake. They also manage historic preservation easements in OPS. We have easements throughout the state on various historic properties. So some of those are gift easements where people have actually written into the deed that we get some say in how the property is altered and developed. So we can make sure that it's done in a historically appropriate manner so that the house or the building or whatever retains its historic integrity. In some cases, that also applies to archaeology. So some of our easements they also include archaeology. So any ground disturbance would get reviewed by OPS and then potentially presented to us as the archaeologists to weigh in on. So some of those easements are perpetual, they are forever. Others are term easements. So sometimes when we give out tax credits or capital grants, these other things that the Office of Preservation Services does, we will take an easement on the property to make sure that the work is done the way that we would want to see the state's money spent. Again, they have lots of tax credits, capital grants, and loans for bricks and mortar projects, mostly. Sometimes capital projects can involve archaeology, especially when you get into, interpretive signage and things like that. And then OPS also is the home of the Maryland Maritime Archaeology Program. Our maritime and underwater archaeologists are in that physical office. And then there's the office that I am a part of, the Office of Research, Survey, and Registration, or ORSR, as we call it. We are the ones that actually maintain the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties, which consists of approximately 45,000 standing structures and about 15,000 archaeological sites, and it grows day by day. So that's where we are currently. We maintain all the databases for that. After this presentation, if you want to look up MHT Medusa, Medusa is our online repository for the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties. You can look for standing structures online. If you're a professional archaeologist that meets the Secretary of the Interior standard, you can also apply for a Medusa archaeology account online, but you do have to meet those standards in order to access archaeological site records, because we want to protect those from people who would want to loot the sites for artifacts. In ORSR, we also do the bulk of the architectural survey and research, both on state lands and on sites that could be in private ownership that are considered of significant importance to the history of Maryland. So we do a lot of field work. We're the field work side of MHT, which is the best side to be on. And then the terrestrial archaeology and remote sensing programs, of course, are there. MHT Press and the MHT Library are housed out of ORSR. The press, we produce occasional publications on archaeological work or on standing structures and historic events. So we have a small press that will produce things like that. And then we also, in ORSR, we manage the historic preservation non-capital grants program. So the grants I mentioned before are capital grants, usually for bricks and mortar type work. These are non-capital grants. You're not building anything with them. Usually it's people putting in an application to do archaeological or architectural research and documentation, or to do a site planning exercise, or to do some sort of educational outreach program, right? Those are the kinds of things we see in the non-capital grant program. So the Office of Archaeology is actually set up a little bit differently. We're not one of those physical or functional offices. We're actually split up amongst the other functional offices. So we're broken up into both the Office of Research, Survey, and Registration, which I'm a part of, and the Office of Preservation Services. In all, we have 7 full-time archaeologists at MHT that are part of the archaeology office, and again, I'm the chief of that. So the Maryland Code, State Finance and Procurement Article, subsection 5A through 34. There's not going to be a test at the end or anything, so you don't have to remember that number, but I'm just pointing out to you where the legislation is. It establishes that there is an archaeology office at MHT. It establishes that there is a research unit within that office, and it also, in later subsections, describes some of the tasks that the office is to undertake on behalf of the state. And then it states that the office must at least contain a chief archaeologist, a state terrestrial archaeologist, and a state underwater archaeologist. And of course, we need folks to assist us in the field and in the review and compliance section. So there's additional archaeologists that have been hired to help, fulfill all the duties of the SHPO's office and the State Office of Archaeology. So you have to have a chief archaeologist, a state terrestrial archaeologist, and a state underwater archaeologist. And it establishes my position as the office's administrative head. Basically, I oversee 2 full-time staff as well as a summer intern. This is my opportunity to advertise our program. If you happen to know a young person that is, or you are a young person, some of you don't have your cameras on, so I don't really know. But if you happen to know a young person that is enrolled in an undergraduate or a graduate archaeology or anthropology program, or even a closely related field, we do offer a paid internship, which is a hard thing to find. We have a paid summer internship. We usually put out the call for applications in January, and then in about this first or second week of February, we ask that people get those applications to us. And so if you watch our webpage, that'll eventually be put up on our webpage every year, and you can apply for our internship program. It's very fieldwork heavy, and it's a good learning experience. And I think all of our past interns are still actually employed as archaeologists in one way or the other, or they're still in school. A couple of them are still in school. In addition to the 2 full-time staff and the intern, I also direct 4 additional archaeologists in certain tasks. You can see up there on the screen some of the tasks that these different archaeologists undertake. So I'm considered the lead for certain specific tasks, but I'm not their direct supervisor. There's a different person that signs off on the time sheets. And then, one of my main purposes, one of my main things is to direct the overall research agenda of the Office of Archaeology and ensure that we meet our 5-year goals and that we have the things that we need to do our work. And a lot of that is, again, research and field work, as well as public outreach and engagement. Those are the really fun aspects of the job. So that's a bit about sort of the setup of the trust and the day-to-day and sort of various responsibilities within our office. I want to kind of move on to talk quite a bit more, in a bit more detail about the best part of my job, as I said, which is the research and the public archaeology aspects of it. So you really, I enjoy working with the public to create a meaningful contribution to understanding the history and the prehistory of the state of Maryland. So as archaeologists, we learn about and interpret the past through material culture, or basically, my kids are always upset when I say this, but digging in people's trash. I'm a glorified trash man. I dig through people's trash, take copious notes on it, and hopefully we can learn something important about human behavior doing that. And we do a lot of archaeology using the traditional shovel and trowel methods of excavation and documentation that are kind of illustrated on this screen here. But increasingly, beginning in the last few years since I took over as chief archaeologist, we've been moving in a different direction. Now, we've not abandoned traditional field methods. We still do traditional excavation, but we've augmented those methods in recent years with techniques called remote sensing. These are techniques that allow us to see beneath the soil before we actually do the excavation. This is really advantageous for us because it allows us to do, because we have a small crew that's available all the time, it does allow us to contribute real hard data that is useful for better understanding sites and survey areas throughout the state, working in small increments. So we can work in just 2 or 3 days a month. We can get a lot of meaningful information, and the end results will eventually allow us to conduct what I like to call surgical excavation. So we can really make the most of the time that we have to do the traditional excavation methods if we've done the legwork up front of this remote sensing work. So we can, when we get those opportunities, like our annual 11-day field session with the Archaeological Society of Maryland, that usually takes place near Memorial Day. When we have those longer extended periods of time when we can be out in the field, we can really make the most of that time. And this image shows 2 pieces of the kit that we use to do that. If you see the gentleman in the pink/red shirt there with the hat on, he's using a piece of equipment called a magnetic susceptibility meter. Looks kind of like a metal detector. We do also have a metal detector that we use, but this is a little bit more sophisticated of a piece of equipment. That's a technique that essentially measures the magnetizability of the soil. I won't get into all the boring details of how it works, but basically when humans have been in an area in the past, they tend to modify the soils, either through the addition of organics to the soil, a lot of leaving trash and refuse and human waste and all kinds of other stuff in the area changes the composition of the soil, right? From what its background normal makeup is. Burning is the really big one. Burning really modifies the soil and makes it highly magnetizable. Bringing in soils from outside the area can be picked up. There's a whole slew of activities that humans undertake that really change the soil, but burning is the big one. This type of technique does not give you really detailed look at what's under the soil, but it's really good at finding sites. It's good at, it's easily and quickly deployed, and it's good at finding sites in an area where you're not sure where the site is, or maybe there's no artifacts on the surface. And you can see there a map of an area that we surveyed, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a little bit. And you can see there's this red anomaly there that was identified through the magnetic susceptibility meter on that landscape. The other example over on the right, you can see me carrying our flux gate gradiometer. You almost always see me as the individual at the truss carrying the gradiometer because you have to be completely devoid of metal whenever you're using this piece of equipment. So I have to get rid of my wedding ring. I have to make sure I don't have any clothes with zippers or eyelets and things like that on them. So I have to be completely degaussed, completely free of metal. The flux gate gradiometer is a little different. The magnetic susceptibility meter is what we call an active technique. So it's actually it's sending a signal into the soil and seeing how the soil reacts to it. It's measuring how magnetizable is the soil. The flux gate gradiometer, by contrast, is a passive technique. It's not doing anything to the ground. What it's doing is it's measuring the Earth's natural magnetic field at that given point on the landscape. And a gradiometer is basically, it's a series of magnetometers that are in an array. They're spaced a set distance apart. And this is a dual flux gate gradiometer. And basically I walk along with it and it's taking a reading basically constantly. And it's giving me a measurement in nanoteslas. Usually the way we have it set up, you can change the settings a little bit, but we usually have it set up to measure everything negative 100 all the way up to positive 100 above 0. So it's looking for things that are not in the norm and mapping those. So then the other major piece of equipment that we have is our ground penetrating radar, or GPR equipment. And it's a piece of equipment you can see down there on the bottom, the little movie that's playing. There's it looks like a lawnmower. We're not actually mowing the lawn, but we're collecting data in tightly spaced transects. In this case, they're 25 centimeters apart. So we're running back and forth with this piece of equipment, and we're collecting the data. And unlike the flux-gate gradiometer, the flux-gate gradiometer can see individual features and artifact deposits in the soil, but it sees them all in 2 dimensions, right? It sees length and width, but everything's compressed together. It can't tell you how deep something is. So even though you might have a feature here, it looks like one big blob in the data instead of 2 distinct features, because it's seeing it all in 2 dimensions. The GPR is not like that. The ground penetrating radar actually collects a 3D data cube. Each time we're walking one of those transects from the video before, we're actually collecting a slice, a vertical slice of that area all along the transect. So we're getting, you know, a slice from top of the soil to the bottom of the soil. So we're getting that slice of it. And then we're taking those and we're stacking those next to one another until what we end up with is a 3D data cube and a map like the one you see there on your screen. This is a map from a pretty sad case in Baltimore. This is the Laurel Cemetery in Baltimore City. This was a historic African-American cemetery that during the mid-20th century, some developers teamed up with the powers that be, the government, the city government, and possibly the state government, and you know, really you know, disregarded this historic Black cemetery, and there were over 2,000 historic burials there, and most of them are under parking lot now and under a strip mall. At the time, the newspapers all said that the burials were removed to Carroll County. That, in fact, was a symbolic removal. They removed a handful of burials to Carroll County, and the rest were left in place and paved over. This is unfortunately a pretty common occurrence for underrepresented communities throughout the country. And this was a particularly egregious case. We don't typically get too involved in cemetery surveys, but this one was so egregious. And in addition, there were some monies from the state that were going to go into developing a kind of memorial on this spot between the street and the now parking lot. So we wanted to make sure that those that the burials that we knew were probably still present would not be impacted by the construction that was going to take place there. And so we did this GPR survey, and you can see all those little black rectangles that if you looked at a scale, they're about 6 feet long. Those are all burials stacked up one next to each other. Almost looks like rows of corn in that image. Some of them so close together that they're almost on top of each other, but those are all burials there. We counted over 100 burials in that tiny little space there. Some a little deeper than others, but that's one of the things that GPR can do. Just a second. Okay, here we go. It's not just useful for cemeteries, though. So it's great on archaeological sites. On archaeological sites, these tools can be really used to dramatic effect. So this is GPR data from the Maiden's Choice 1 site. And what we've got is comparison of, it's a late 18th, early 19th century dwelling site in Washington County, 18 WA 634. This is a roughly 20 by 40 foot structure. And there you can see a before and after excavation shot. So you see the GPR data, and we've laid out some blue squares where we plan to do excavation. The next image on the right, you can see where the actual excavation units went in, and you can actually see the exposed foundations after we dug into the soil and removed the topsoil and excavated all of it. So you can actually see how well this technique work. Okay. So I want to actually let me go back real quick. So I want to kind of switch gears now again and look at one specific recent project that MHT became involved in, and kind of show how these techniques, you know, the remote sensing, the traditional excavation methods work together, work with public engagement, work with our, in this case, our non-capital grant program. We were able to, you know, the ASM was able to obtain funding through our non-capital grant program. And all of it just kind of was married and came together to really make an important contribution to understanding Maryland's history. In this case, it was the search for one of the last known settlements of the Mattaponi and Patuxet Indians. So this is the Billingsley site. It is represented here by a red polygon that encompasses nearly 150 acres. That's not a particularly useful site boundary. Most of our site boundaries are much smaller and much more concise. But there's some historical reasons for why this one is so large, which I'll mention here in a moment. Basically, the site is situated at the confluence of the main branch of the Patuxet River and the western branch on land that's owned today by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. In order to do any excavation work on this property, you have to get a permit through our office, and you also have to deal with the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. So it's owned by Maryland DNR, but it's managed by MNC PPC under a 99-year lease that they have with the state to operate this as a house museum and a farm. So again, it's at the head of the expansive Jug Bay wetlands, which I saw you guys are going to be doing a tour of soon. So Stephanie Sperling, who was actually my co-PI on this project, who will be given the tour, she'll probably mention a little bit about Billingsley because we worked on that project there. These boundaries, this huge 150-acre boundaries, I believe taken from Lori Stepanidis's dissertation work in the 1960s or 1970s. She was looking at Patuxet River sites and was cataloging the work of several early 20th century artifact collectors, arrowhead hunters, who had been working in multiple locations across the property. She interviewed them, and she you know, kind of drew a circle around this large area where all of them had, you know, told her, well, I worked over here and I worked over here. And so she kind of encompassed all of it into this, this large site boundary. The interest of the collectors was no doubt in large part inspired by a couple of references to the property that we have in the historic records. We know that in 1650, a Quaker gentleman called Major John Billingsley. The name Major is a little bit suspect. It's a little bit like Colonel Sanders. Nobody really knows which branch of the military he belonged to or has ever found any record as to you know, what the story behind that is. But in any event, he was called Major John Billingsley. And he transported 14 indentured servants into the colony of Maryland in the 1650s. And back then you were usually rewarded for that with land. So in 1662, which was actually after his death, his heirs received 700 acres of land, which was to be called Billingsley Point and was to be situated between the confluence of these two rivers. Indeed, Augustine Herman's 1670 map of the Chesapeake depicts a European-built structure in that location. It may not represent really that someone was, you know, that a European individual had built a house in that location. What it's more likely representing is just these house structures are supposed to represent patented land that had already been claimed by the English. We don't know if English individual was living there. It's possible that an indentured servant or someone was sent up to claim the land on behalf of Major Billingsley. But we do know that Billingsley nor his heirs ever lived on this location. In fact, it doesn't look like any Europeans were living on this property until much later in the 17th century and possibly even the first part of the 18th century. The Billingsleys are described as always being from Calvert Cliffs area or being from the Nansemond River of Virginia. So they're never described as being of the Patuxet. We do know that this land, however, was inhabited because two Native American villages are recorded on the map, on the Augustine Herman map. Both one shown on each side of that structure, one with the name Wiggawamak, the other Kapahan. We don't really know that those are the names per se of the villages. Native Americans that I've spoken to about this say, well, you know, we didn't really have names per se for our villages. We just had place names. And, you know, maybe that meant the place where the two rivers came together. Wig in Algonquin is a lot of times associated with river and water. But what Wiggawamek means, we don't really know, or Kapahan, because part of the problem is these are Algonquin words that a Dutch immigrant named Augustine Herman is trying to translate into English. So it's being sort of moved through multiple languages there. And in fact, he's also being informed by other people. He's being told about a lot of these places through secondhand information. So what it actually was called, we have no idea. But we do know that there were people, because we also have, with the Native Americans there, because we also have this reference from the Archives of Maryland at a time when the legislature was debating establishing a kind of early reservation for the Indians of the Patuxent area on Billingsley's land. So in May of 1674, we read the following vote was set down by Mr. Truman that the Mattaponi and Patuxent Indians do continue upon the land on which they now live, it being the quantity of 700 acres more or less, according to patent, and that the same be purchased by the country of the orphans of Major John Billingsley, to which it now belongs, the said Billingsley having formerly purchased it of the said Indians. So, you know, this was handed from the upper house down to the lower house. They kind of argued about it for a while about whether we should buy the land or we should lease the land. And ultimately, we never get a resolution. Whatever the resolution was, it never got recorded in the records that have come down to us. So we don't know if this plan ever came to fruition, but we know that the record here, at least in 1674, is saying that the Mattaponi and Patuxent do continue upon the land, and that land is the 700 acres that's mentioned in this record. So they're there on Billingsley's land. So this is what the landscape at the site looks like today. This is looking due south. You can see what it is today called the Billingsley House, and was known historically as the Holiday House. Turns out both names are probably incorrect, as it was likely built by the Weems family, who acquired the property around 1730. So the Holidays probably lived there in an earlier earth-fast house, and the Billingsleys never put on the property, as far as we can tell. So what you can see coming in from the right, you see the western branch of the Patuxent River flowing in, and then you can see shooting straight down the main branch of the Patuxent River there, which is embayed at Jug Bay there. So it opens up, it widens up right there. And you can see where we were excavating, our excavation in progress there in the fields just to the south of the Holiday House. And this landscape really would have been just an amazingly resource-rich place for the indigenous population. Bear in mind that you know, we do try to protect archaeological sites. This one actually has eyes on it all the time because it's managed under a lease. There's a caretaker in the building up there, and the folks that are there on property at MNC-PPC keep an eye on it and monitor it. So, but this landscape really would have been just an amazingly resource-rich place for the indigenous population. Rico Newman, who is he's a prominent member of the Chopco band of the Piscataway Nation. He's one of our field session volunteers who worked on this project. He's a member of the ASM. He described this location as the pre-contact Trader Joe's in a little lunchtime lecture that he provided on sort of a Native American perspective on this site. And I think that's just a really great observation to make. This was a very resource-rich landscape that people had access to here. So why did we choose this specific spot here at the southern south of the Holiday House? Because remember, we have this huge 150-acre site boundary. How did we know to look here? So our research at the site really began in the fall of 2018. We knew from the site files that a lot of the collectors that Stephanitis had interviewed, they mentioned working near to the old Holiday House. There's basically two farm fields there that would have been plowed at the time. There's one to the south and one to the east. So it had to be one of those two fields. We decided to use that technique I mentioned, magnetic susceptibility, that works really great at finding sites when you don't see a lot of artifacts on the surface. Back when these collectors were working in the early 20th century, they were doing mold bore plowing, so the artifacts are getting churned up and brought to the surface all the time. Now, in most of Maryland, we do no-till plowing, so surface collection doesn't work quite as well as it did back then. And so we did this magnetic susceptibility technique, sampling every 5 meters. We did that up in the field to the east, which isn't shown here. Didn't really find much of anything. But down here in the field to the south, we found this large magnetic anomaly. So we sampled in every one of those in grid squares and every 5 meters throughout the field. And it basically identified this roughly 1.3 acre anomaly in the field there to the south. And this map is really a perfect match for that village identified on Augustine Herman's map as for the location is just right. So at that point, we pretty much immediately entered into discussions with MNC PPC about using this as our field session site for that 11-day field session that I mentioned. Ultimately, they agreed, and in 2019, we held our first field session there with the ASM. Myself and again, Stephanie Sperling of MNC PPC serving as co-principal investigators for the project. One of the decisions we made early on was to conduct additional remote sensing in the location to see if we could really refine down where we should put in test units. So we laid out some 20 by 20 meter grids kind of in the heart of that red anomaly area. And we did flux gate gradiometry to try and identify a little better what was available there. So this is the results of that gradiometer survey. The test units you see outlined in pink here are the ones we put in 2019. I'll get to the blue ones here in a little bit, but in 2019, we really focused on these anomalies that showed up in the gradiometer. The highs show up as these green, so the really high numbers show up as green, and the really low numbers show up as the white flares on the screen there. And these flares were really interesting to us. They were suggestive of trash or refuse pits, just the sort of thing that an archaeologist likes to find. And in particular, the way that some of them clustered, you see that tight cluster of 3, we really wanted to hone in on those. So we laid out 4 initial test units, and then we expanded out from there, ultimately excavating 12 test units during that first field session at the ASM. And what did we find? So in short, we found extensive evidence of prehistoric or pre-contact occupation with multiple components represented. There was some historic evidence, but not a lot, and nothing that could be definitively tied to the late 17th century contact period when those Native American groups are mentioned in the historic English record. But here you can see, some of the artifact types that were coming out, lots of pottery, lots of stone tool, and one of the intact features being excavated. Stephanie Sperling's there in the dark green shirt excavating this dark stain in the soil, which is one of these trash pits. And the kind of things that are coming out of the trash pits and this plow zone above them, it's mostly, lots of prehistoric lithics, mostly quartzite, some of those diagnostic, mostly terminal archaic and early woodland points, forms like Bear Island and Piscataway points, lots of late archaic stem points, and I think maybe a couple of woodland triangular points. There actually may have only been one woodland triangular point that we found, and some prehistoric pottery. We found a smattering of Potomac Creek pottery, as well as what we mostly found were Accokeek sherds. Those date from about 900 to 300 BC.
with some minor amounts of Mockley ceramics. Those date from about 8200 to 900, and Pokes Creek ceramics, 500 BC to 8300. So some different pottery types, lots of fire cracked rock from big hearth fires, and then some ground stone objects like stone axes and things like that. A lot of them broken up. And then an interesting thing, we found that bone preservation at this particular site is actually quite poor. We didn't find a whole lot of bone or evidence of meals on this location. So here you can see some drone imagery showing some of the excavations in 2019 in progress. Maybe you can make out sort of the dark soil stains in a couple of the units to the west there. Those are the features being excavated. But pretty much every one of these units was situated where we predicted from the gradiometer that there would be a feature there. We found one. And they appear as these dark soil stains in the images. So this is one of those features. I don't have time to discuss all of them in detail, but this is one of those features. Feature 2 seemed to be a place where there was heavy burning going on, probably mostly deer bone that was being burned for marrow extraction. So this is one of the few places where we did find some preserved bone because it was so heated up. It's this prehistoric roasting pit that we interpreted here. All of these features, as well as many of the artifacts, were embedded in an expansive buried A horizon, anthropogenic horizon that was across the landscape. So that's kind of a quick overview of what we found in 2019. Basically evidence of this large pre-contact, primarily late Archaic and early woodland village, probably dating based on the artifacts of the period between about 3000 BC and AD 300 or so. So we left in 2019, assuming that we would be back the following year to learn more. And of course, COVID had other ideas. So the ASM had secured a historic preservation non-capital grant from our office in 2019 with the intention of holding a second field session at Billingsley the following spring in 2020. That, of course, landed during the very early days of the pandemic, when there wasn't yet a vaccine, when there was a lot of concern about how the virus was spreading, and we didn't know a lot about whether you could catch it outdoors or not. So we didn't hold a field session in 2020. And suddenly we had a lot of time to sit and think about a plan for returning to the next field session that wouldn't come until 2021. So in that time period, we turned our attention to the question of where are the European trade goods? If Native Americans are continuing to live on this landscape into the 17th century, we should find trade goods, evidence of items that were traded from the English to Native Americans. So we should see that as some evidence of that kind of trade and exchange with the English on the archaeological site. So how could we find that? And because we hadn't seen anything like that in 2019. By the end of the 1630s, the Patuxet peoples likely had access to English trade goods from both the west and the east. William Claiborne was active from his base on Kent Island by 1629. Another gentleman named Henry Flint was making major inroads up the Potomac River by 1632. And guess what? The Mattaponi and Patuxet people are centered right in between those two warring factions. One's allied with Virginia, that's Claiborne on Kent Island, the other's allied with Maryland. And so they're situated ideally to exploit the access to goods from both directions. The two factions of English would eventually collide at a site called Mattaponi or Mattapaniet, which is near the head of the Patuxet River in 1635. That location is believed to be about 4 miles away from the confluence of the western branch of the Patuxet River. So really, this location is very close to what's shown as Wigglewammack here. In 1635, Henry Eubanks, who was working for William Claiborne and Thomas Smith, were accosted and arrested by Henry Fleet, and his supporters who were trading for Maryland. So it's getting the Marylanders versus the Virginians, and the Marylanders said, you're trading in Maryland without authorization from Lord Baltimore. Claiborne's men were there specifically to trade with the Patuxet Indians, and they were
specifically, it says in the record they were heading to this location of Mattapan. All of this suggests that the inhabitants of Wigglewammek were just a few miles away, likely would have had access to at least some English trade goods by 1635, and likely even earlier, as early as 1629. Again, our effort was unsuccessful in 2019, so we tried a slightly different tactic in 2021. So in an effort to locate physical evidence that could collaborate this English accounts of the historic Indian occupation, we turned to metal detecting. So we did a major survey with a group called the Maryland Free State Treasure Club. And we decided what we really wanted to focus in looking for was brass triangles, because brass triangles are specifically a type of European metal that's adapted by Native hands. These objects are not traded to Native Americans as these triangular perforated points. They're in fact usually traded as kettles. And the kettles they're cheaply made, they're very thinly walled, they're a very specific thin gauge, and they're cut up into these triangular points, which were useful for hunting and warfare. We have accounts of some of these being embedded in the lumbar vertebrae of individuals, and folks in the Pequot War up in Connecticut actually getting shot with some of these. So they're uniquely Native American objects, and they're made of an easily detectable European metal, copper, or copper alloys. So they should be easy to find if they are present. So we searched all over this field with the Free State Treasure Club. We ultimately did not find a definitive brass triangle, but we did find a piece of brass scrap, which you see down there on the lower left. Brass scrap is the right thickness and the right gauge to have come from one of these points. They're all very specific gauge. And so based on that hunch, we, as well as the fact that a hand-wrought nail was found in the same general area, we decided that we would focus our attentions in 2021. Get my screen to advance again here. Here we go. So here you can see the results of the spring 2021 metal detector survey. If you can see my cursor right down here, this was the area where the brass scrap was found, and the wrought nail were found. That's where we decided to focus our attentions when we went back in 2021, and that's to the west of where we had worked in 2019. We approached it two ways. We did want to look at that buried A horizon that we had examined from the late Archaic and early Woodland transition period. We wanted to look at that some more. And so these units that are kind of on the eastern edge and coming in from the north, we wanted to kind of see if we could find the edge of the buried A horizon. So we started north of it, and we started coming in looking for the edge of it. But then the units over here, we put in 2 units initially, test unit 15, which is right here, and test unit 17, which is right here. Those were put in where the brass scrap was found and where the wrought nail was found, hoping to find more artifacts of that type. And it turned out that was a really good strategy. An oyster roasting pit was identified in test unit 15, and we eventually opened up this larger block around it. And the bulk of what we suspect are contact era objects were actually recovered from these units in this area. Test unit 17, that's just a few meters away, was not nearly as productive, but it did still yield a European flint fragment. So, and one that's heavily nibbled. So we think that it was actually used by Native Americans. So here's that potential contact subassemblage identified in the area around the roasting pit, which we call feature 9. It includes the brass fragment, 2 French flint flakes, some fragments of a Chesapeake pipe. Those are distinctive 17th century native-made pipe type. And 85% of the Potomac Creek sherds recovered from the site. Potomac Creek is a type of pottery that typically dates from about AD 1300 to 1700, so it goes up into the contact period.
and 85% of the cover of the assemblage of Potomac Creek found throughout the entire site came from this block one over top of this feature. So all but 7 of the sherds came from near the oyster roasting pit. And then, in fact, 2 Potomac points, the quartz points there at the top of the one image, those are lithics that are characteristic of the woodland time period. And if you look at the French flint, the close up here, you can see that there's a little bit of working on the edge here. We have Zach Singer, who's a lithics person in our office. He took a look at it and said, yeah, it does look nibbled. We had a couple other people look at it and said the same thing. So the fact that this is actually reworked suggests a Native American was using it. While Europeans used European flint, obviously, and enslaved Africans or others could have also used it, you wouldn't typically expect to see someone reusing it to this fine grain. So they're making the most out of this really excellent material for flint knapping, because they're still using a lot of stone technology in these societies. And then we have the mended fragments of this Chesapeake pipe right here. Here's the aforementioned oyster roasting pit. The bulk of the cataloging report writing was actually done by Applied History and Archaeology Associates, who the ASM hired to write up the reports from 2019 and 2021. We worked with them. We wrote some, I wrote, and Zach Singer wrote some sections of these. Also, Stephanie Sperling wrote some sections of the 2019 report. But we worked with them, and they produced a final report. This image is from that. And one of the other things the non-capital fund was used for was some C14 AMS dating. And there you can see the results of some of the features from both 2019 and 2021 that were sampled. We analyzed nutshells from those sites. And the really cool one here is feature 9, the oyster roasting pit. That yielded a C14 date of 363 plus or minus 18 radiocarbon years before present. You have to calibrate radiocarbon dates, and once you do that, you get a calendrical date between AD 1458 and 1631. So that comports really well with both the age range for Potomac Creek ceramics, as well as the 17th century Chesapeake pipe fragments in the European flint, all those things being used in the 17th century. And in essence, it may reflect the Patuxent Indian occupation in the area that's just, like 1 or 2 generations before the folks that are mentioned in the 1674 document and that are shown on the Augustan Herman map. So it's a couple generations before, but also probably folks that had some contact with the English traders. As I said, maybe as early as 1629, and they're just 4 miles away from the events that happened in 1635 at Mattapan. So I'm kind of wrapping things up here. I know I'm going a little bit long, but the identification of a partially intact feature that's potentially related to the indigenous contact period is really quite significant, because contact period sites in Maryland are really rare. They're very elusive throughout Maryland. They're hard to find. So this is a great example of the combined use of geophysical testing, metal detection survey, traditional archaeological excavation, with the help of a whole lot of volunteers from the public, that really proved to be successful for identifying an important context like this. And of course, all of our ASM volunteers and other members of the public. This is open to the public. You don't have to be an ASM member, but it's a great opportunity. It's 11 days straight. That's kind of it for me. In conclusion, I kind of hope you learned a little bit about what MHT is and what it does, particularly focusing on the Office of Archaeology, and one of the really cool projects that we've worked on recently, how we work with the public. And I guess I just want to say thank you for inviting me to give this talk, and to our Office of Archaeology staff for all their hard work on this project, MNC PPC for their partnership, and especially, again, the volunteers that make the field session every year a reality. And then one final note I will add, there's a YouTube video down there at the bottom. If you really want to get a feel for what the annual Tyler Bastion field session is all about,
go to the MHT YouTube channel or go directly to that link. We were actually featured on MPT's Outdoors Maryland, the second year of the field session when we were looking for this contact period component. And you can check out the video, the whole segment on Outdoors Maryland that was focused on the field session if you follow the link there on the screen. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions if people want to hang around. I see some things came up in the chat, but I haven't had a chance to look at them because I've been yammering on this whole time.
So interesting, Matt. Thank you so much. It was fascinating to hear like the story of seeing the reference on a map to tracking that to a specific site and then the process through which you uncovered the artifacts. That was so cool. Are there questions? And thank you for plugging Stephanie Sterling again. She'll be here 1 month from today. And the Jug Bay excursion is Saturday, October 22nd, or whatever the Saturday is that corresponds more closely to that.
I had a question for Matt. Matt, one of the things you said that was that burning really changes the landscape.
Yeah.
Are you talking about, when you're talking about burning, are you talking about like hearths and roasting pits, or because
Yeah, you know, it just looks like a big blob there in the field, but you got to remember that's after centuries of plowing. So what you're really seeing are probably the results of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, well, really thousands of campfires, because you're going to need one just about every night. And so those eventually get plowed out. Those hearths get plowed out, and it just kind of ends up being this smear of altered soils on the landscape. So even though that maybe a lot of the hearths have been truncated by plowing, you still can see the evidence there that they were present. And hopefully, you know, once we get below the plow zone, we might find a few of them that are preserved, and we can, you know, look at things like diet.
okay, thank you.
Mhm. All right. I guess I answered all the questions.
It would appear that way.
Well, thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much. So I missed the first couple of minutes of recording this, but I've recorded the majority of it, and it will end up on our YouTube channel shortly as soon as I can, you know, get it processed and up there. If you have any objections to that, just let me know. But so then others can come and enjoy it and benefit from your expertise. Thank you so much, Matthew. I really appreciate it. It's good to hear all of this.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks,
I
Matt.
Yep.
Is there any club business? I should have asked this at the beginning, but I did not. Is there anything that we need to talk about? If not, thanks, everybody. I hope to see you all soon. Take care.